here. So, and we'll give Doug. Can you tell me when you see the live stream appear on the YouTube?
Will do. Not yet. I don't see it yet.
Okay.
There we go. Oh. Ours. Oh, okay.
I see 6 people watching, apparently.
There we go. Well, my goodness, this is all working. Amazing. We're just learning as we go with this technology, and as we've one of the things that we gave feedback on the latest chapter leaders meeting is that despite the challenges that COVID has given us, we found that it's really opened up the opportunity for us to be able to engage a lot more.
Ben, you're going to have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
To unmute, hon.
Everybody got muted somehow. And Ben, you're still muted.
Okay, now I am unmuted. Somebody keeps muting me, Belinda.
Sorry, I'm sorry because somebody else keeps talking when you're talking, so I apologize. So everybody else, be quiet. Okay, all right. I'm gonna unmute all. Okay. Doug, I'll unmute everybody. There we go. And then
all right.
I'm not gonna mute anybody. Okay. 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 Sorry.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. It is 7 o'clock, and I just want to welcome everybody to our Portland RTB chapter meeting. We are super blessed and excited and honored to have the founder and president of Reasons to Believe join us for this chapter meeting. And, also really excited that the topic, which we actually picked, I think several months ago, is so relevant right now, right where we are. With the wildfires going on, the first question that everybody has is, what does climate change have to do with this? And so I think it's just really, really great that we're able to to have Dr. Ross come and join us and speak from his latest book, which is Weathering Climate Change. And if you haven't got it yet, you need to get a copy of it. So we're looking forward to that. My name is Ben Clifton, and I work with a great team of chapter leaders here in the Portland area. And we have monthly meetings, and most of the time they are on Zoom, and it's afforded us to have a broad audience, and it's afforded us to welcome the RTB scholars. I know that for most of you, Dr. Ross needs no introduction, but I do want, because we do have some guests that are joining us from, and if you happen to, if you wouldn't mind muting your microphone as you join us, that would be great. So, Dr. Ross, I'm just going to read from his cover here. Dr. Ross is the founder and president of Reasons to Believe, and the author of many books, including Improbable Planet and Why the Universe is the Way It Is. He is an astronomer and a teaching pastor at a church near Caltech. And Dr. Ross has addressed students and faculty on over 300 campuses in the United States and all over the globe on a wide variety of science faith topics, from science conferences and churches to government and private research labs. Excuse me. Dr. Ross presents powerful evidence for a purpose-filled universe. I just wanted to add just a quick little personal testimony of the impact that that Dr. Ross has had on my life and reasons to believe. So I was an atheist until I was about 33. I have a technical background, and a lot of my objections were science related. And for many reasons that I won't go into, God changed my heart, but my mind was still full of questions. And the very first time I was brave enough to go into a Christian bookstore, I was looking around to see what I should read now, being a new Christian. And on the very bottom shelf, there was a little book called The Fingerprint of God. And so I picked it up and I started looking at it. And as soon as I read about the first paragraph, I couldn't believe what I had encountered. And that book started answering all of the questions that had been so much a part of me not believing. And so uh, to make a long story short, I got very hooked on RTB and I leveraged their resources heavily. It was when the internet was first starting to become a reality, and I was able to utilize their resources and went through the apologetics training course. At the time, it was on little cassettes, and became a volunteer apologist and chapter leader, and have been engaged ever since. We've been fortunate to have a number of the RTB scholars come to the Portland area back when traveling was possible, and including Dr. Ross. And the thrilling thing about this book, for me in particular, is the last section where he offers these win-win scenarios. And what's really cool is that I can remember when Dr. Ross visited us and my family, he was talking about these solutions like years ago, 10 years ago. I can't even remember how long ago. And as a result of those conversations, my daughter went on to write a paper about ostriches and the benefits of ostrich over beef. And both my daughter and my son spent a gap year in South Africa and got very familiar with ostrich there. And so I personally have become a real ostrich fan. And I can trace that all the way back 10 or 12 years ago when Dr. Ross was visiting. So I say all that just to acknowledge and thank Hugh personally and RTB, the ministry, for the impact that they've had on my life. So now we are here and privileged to have Dr. Ross talk about his latest work, Weathering Climate Change. And the way this is going to work is we're just going to turn it over to Hugh to give a presentation. And then when he's done, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. And depending on when he wraps up, we'll be able to take some questions both on Zoom and on our YouTube comments. So we'll tell you how that's going to work when we get to the end. So without further ado, Dr. Ross, the floor is yours. And again, thank you so much for your willingness to do this for us.
Well, it's interesting you talked about our website in the early days. Back in the very early 1990s, we kept winning the best Christian website until I discovered we were the only Christian organization that had a website. So after a while, we stopped winning that. So no, I've retooled this talk on weathering climate change. Our staff has told me that the talk that I was presenting was way too technical in their words. As I looked at it and my wife looked at it, we said, it's not so much that it's super technical, it's just very content rich. So what I've tried to do is take this talk and trim it down to just the kind of basic essentials. But I appreciate the feedback you have because they're wanting me to be able to present this to a general audience. and not just to people that are science nerds like many of you might be, and I certainly am myself. So, and it's a little shorter talk than I normally give. That'll give us more time for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to share screen so that you can see my visuals. And you should all be seeing my first slide, which is simply to let you know that if you don't get to ask a question tonight, I do take questions on both Facebook and Twitter, and all of our staff scholars do. So if you got questions for any of them, take advantage of that. And if you're not aware of it, Reasons to Believe does have a 24/7 YouTube channel, and we're putting up videos there on a daily basis. You can subscribe for free, and when you do, you'll be notified of the new videos that are there. And I also ask you to try to encourage others to become subscribers. Again, it's free, but the more subscribers we get, the more that Reasons to Believe benefits. And I talked very briefly about climate change in the 15th chapter of Improbable Planet. And you can get a free chapter of that book at reasons.org/Ross. But this is the book that Ben was talking about. And again, you can get a free chapter by going to that same URL, reasons.org/Ross. And the background there, I show my wife in the early days of August. I think I took this shot on August 3rd in Canada. And I went from 85 degrees one day and dropped down to 20 degrees the next day. So that's real climate change taking place. And just making the point that when it comes to climate change, some parts of the world are hardly affected at all, and other parts are dramatically affected. Canada, for example, is warming 5 times faster than the rest of the world on average, and Eastern Europe is actually getting colder than it did in the past. Global warming models actually predict that parts of the world will indeed get colder as the climate warms up. And I want to begin with this slide, because this is kind of the big unknown from a layperson's perspective. Lay people, and for that matter, I've discovered that PhD research biologists mistakenly assume that the sun has been constant in its luminosity. All stars change in their luminosity as they get older. And this graph shows you that when our sun is forming and accumulating mass, it gets dramatically brighter. The brightness of a star goes up with a 4th power of its mass. Then it stops accumulating mass and begins to lose a small amount of its mass, and that causes a dramatic cooling. But the moment that our star ignites nuclear fusion, fusing hydrogen into helium, then it begins to get brighter and brighter as it gets older and older. That's simply a result of the fact that the density at the core of the sun increases as it fuses hydrogen into helium. And that little yellow dot there shows you the time in the history of the sun when the sun reaches maximum luminosity stability. And astronomers have been looking at millions of stars in our Milky Way galaxy, and they discovered that our star, the sun, is 5 times more stable in its luminosity stability than any other known star. And it turns out we need that stability in order to be able to sustain global human civilization. But the enigma of this graph I'm showing you is that for more than 90% of the history of life on planet Earth, our planet has had no ice at all. And here we are, the sun's brighter than it's ever been before in the history of life, and we got ice. And so the first part of the book basically talks about the miracle that we live on a planet with a sun as bright as it is, and yet we got ice. How do we get all this ice in the face of such a very bright sun? And we actually need that ice. I hinted a little bit about that in Improbable Planet. So you find a lot more detail on weathering climate change. Our global civilization vitally depends on ice. In fact, it vitally depends on us being in an ice age cycle. And this entire history of life you see here, the only epoch that we have an ice age cycle, where we cycle between 10% of the continents covered with ice and 20 to 23% being covered with ice, it's literally just the last 2.5 million years. Never before in the life history of the Earth have we had an ice age cycle. And in the book, I talk about 15 different benefits of being in an ice age cycle. I'll briefly hit just 2. The fact that we're in an ice age cycle, and right now we're in what's called an interglacial, where only 10% of the planet is covered with ice. This means that our great agricultural plains are being fed with the meltwater from ice left over from the last ice age. Probably the most dramatic example of this is Asia, because the 3rd largest store of ice on planet Earth, right after Antarctica and Greenland, is the Tibetan Plateau. There's more ice there than there is in the Arctic ice cap. And some melting of that ice that was deposited during the last ice age that feeds 22 of the 30 largest rivers on planet Earth, and explains why Asia is able to feed 3.5 billion people. The Great Plains of India and China are fed by the meltwaters coming out of the Tibetan Plateau. And it's the same thing here in North America. Our greatest rivers flow out of the ice that's melting, left over from the last ice age, predominantly in Montana and especially the Canadian Rocky Mountain Trench. Huge store of ice there, and the melting of that ice feeds the great rivers that water the agricultural plains of North America. In the book, I describe how this is a worldwide phenomena. One of the enigmas of our planet, the mountains are tallest near the equator, and they're not so tall when you get to high latitudes. And this means we have ice left over from the last ice age, literally in countries like Ecuador. Mount Chimborazo has got 6 huge glaciers left over from the last ice age. And the melting of that ice feeds the Amazon River, for example. All right, what I want to do now is actually look at the primary reason we move from a planet with no ice to where we have an ice age cycle. And the biggest factor is actually several, but the most important factor of all, let's see, for some reason this is not advancing. Here we go. Okay, yeah, that little red dot there below the south tip of South America shows you the impact site of what's called the Altanin Impactor. And this is an asteroid that was 1 to 4 kilometers in diameter. A gigantic asteroid. We usually only get hit by asteroids that size once every 50 million years. And what's incredible is we've gotten 3 such asteroids striking the Earth in just the last 2.5 million years. But this strike is what ignited the ice age cycle. It hit in a part of the ocean where it was 17,000 feet deep, but this was such a big asteroid, and it was a stainless steel asteroid, so it was able to penetrate all the way through those 17,000 feet of water, hit the ocean floor, and stirred up all the layers there, and basically caused a worldwide aerosol cloud to encompass the Earth. And that aerosol cloud blocked out the light of the sun for many years. And the blocking out of the light of the sun cooled the entire planet. It also resulted in 1,000-foot high tidal waves ripping through all the world's oceans, even into the Mediterranean. They've just discovered that a 1,000-foot tidal wave rushed up the Adriatic Sea, a direct result of this impactor. And they've been able to date the impactor 2.58 million years ago, and that's the same date for the ignition of the ice age cycle. Now, this is what the Ice Age cycle looks like. When it was first ignited by the L10 impactor, it had a period of 41,000 years. And what drove that was a changing tilt of the rotation axis of planet Earth. Now, of all the planets in the solar system, we have the least change in the rotation axis tilt. Mars tilts back and forth by 60 degrees. We tilt back and forth by only plus or minus 1 degree. But when it tilts down towards 24 degrees, the planet warms up. And when it tilts back to 22 degrees, the planet cools down. And so this is what was driving the cycle until 400, 800,000 years ago. Was a changing tilt of the rotation axis, caused the planet to alternate between periods of being cooler and periods of being warmer. And an ice age would last like 38,000 years, and you get a warm interglacial that's only 3,000 years long. And with a 3,000 year interglacial, that's not enough time to launch and sustain global human civilization. I won't go into the details, it's in the book, but 800,000 years ago, another giant asteroid, and some people think it was a comet because it broke into two pieces. One piece collided in the South China Sea, the other piece landed in Laos. But it was one of 14 factors that all happened at the same time that changed the Ice Age cycle from a 41,000 year period to a 100,000 year period. So the last 8 ice ages, it's been 100,000 years. And that was crucial for human civilization because that now allowed a warm interglacial to last 10,000 years instead of just 2,000 or 3,000 years. And this particular graph shows you the last 4 ice ages, showing you the temperature change, how the temperature changes, global mean temperature, by about 12 degrees centigrade or 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And what you notice there is that an ice age lasts about 90,000 years, and then you come out of it. But when you come out of it, notice how rapidly the temperature rises to a peak, a sharp peak, and then it drops rapidly back into an ice age. So when you look at the past 3 ice ages, past 4 ice ages, you don't get a long interglacial. It rises to a peak about 2 to 3 degrees centigrade above where we are now, and then rapidly drops back down into an ice age. The one exception we see is the ice age cycle we're in right now. But this next slide basically shows you in detail what's happening to the global mean temperature on time scales of decades or centuries, and basically shows you that during the last ice age, the global mean temperature was jumping up and down by 10 degrees centigrade on time scales of just a few centuries, and explains why humans living during that time were not able to launch and sustain civilization. They were engaged in technology. I wrote in the book about how we now have evidence that humans living 15,000 years ago, 23,000 years ago, 36,000 years ago, were actually engaged in sophisticated agriculture. They were planting grains, harvesting the grains, roasting the grains, grinding them up, and turning them into bakery products, sophisticated bakery products. But this is all done on a very small scale. The biggest farm was probably smaller than 2 acres. And people would be planting not just one species of grain, but 10 or 12 species. Why? Because they couldn't predict which species would produce and which would not. They couldn't count on the climate being stable enough. So humans were forced to engage in small mixed farms. Same thing with their animals. They couldn't afford to specialize. This next slide shows you the last 17,000 years. And that pink curve you see to the left, that's quite typical of what happens whether you're in an ice age or an interglacial. The temperature's jumping up and down by a good 10 degrees or more centigrade on very short time scales. And but beginning about 10,000 years ago, the climate miraculously stabilized, and it's been stable ever since. And towards the left there, you see those two dotted lines. That basically is showing you what's called the Younger Dryas cooling event. And this is what stopped the temperature from going up to its normal maximum. Normally, when you come up on an ice age, the temperature jumps up 2 to 3 degrees centigrade above where we are now. But this Younger Dryas cooling event prevented that from happening. And for 50 years, geologists have been puzzling, what's the cause of this Younger Dryas event? And with some astronomers more than a decade ago that said, well, it's got to be a giant asteroid. But that was met with great skepticism. They said, look, asteroids like that only hit the Earth about once every 50 million years. You're trying to tell us that in just the last 2.5 million, and 2 hit just in the late 800,000, and you're claiming that the biggest one of all hit just 12,800 years ago. They said there's no way. If an asteroid hit just 12,800 years ago, we would definitely see the crater. You would get a crater at least 30 kilometers in diameter, and there's no evidence of that kind of crater anywhere in the world. All that changed about a year ago. What happened a year ago is a NASA aircraft was flying over northern Greenland, and they happened to have their deep ice penetrating radar on, and they saw something totally unexpected. They flew over northwest Greenland, and that little red dot you see there is a place where their deep ice penetrating radar told them there's a crater 32 kilometers in diameter, 3,000 feet under the ice. So it explains why nobody had seen the crater. It was buried under 3,000 feet of ice. And then they sent geologists to the site, and they measured the meltwater coming out from underneath the glacier, and it had all the signatures of an asteroid about 2 kilometers in diameter, made of virtually pure stainless steel. And actually, they should have known it better anyway, because as far back as 11,000 years ago, Eskimos were coming to this part of Greenland to find stainless steel meteorites and turn them into tools. They were actually the first to launch metallurgy. They would gather up these meteorites and cold forge them into rather sophisticated tools. So that should have told you that something must have happened of a dramatic nature for that many stainless steel meteorites to be still left around. But this now explains the Younger Dryas cooling event. Take you back about 15,000 years in the middle of North America. Let me see. Here we go. In the middle of North America was a gigantic glacial lake. This is when thousands of feet of ice were melting off of North America. During the last ice age, 55% of North America was covered by thousands of feet of ice. Portland was completely ice choked. In fact, San Diego in the wintertime was ice choked. The ice went all the way down into Southern California. But as that ice began to melt, it formed this gigantic lake. It's called Lake Agassiz. And it flowed down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico. But when this giant asteroid struck in Greenland, it threw up huge chunks of ice and rocks, and these rocks and ice pelted all over Canada and northern US. And that pelting blocked the flow of water down the Mississippi and opened up 2 more channels for that cold glacial water to run out. And so as a result of the asteroid, Lake Agassiz, instead of being drained into the Gulf of Mexico, now was being drained through the Great Lakes and out through the St. Lawrence River and through Lake Athabasca and Great Slave Lake and Great Bear Lake, out through the Mackenzie River and into the Beaufort Sea. And at that time, there was a powerful ocean current running through from Alaska over Canada into Baffin Island. And it took all of that cold glacial meltwater in between Baffin Island and Greenland and out into the North Atlantic, where it joined the cold glacial meltwater being spilled out through the St. Lawrence. And the combination of those two sources of cold glacial meltwater turned back the Gulf Stream. As you're probably aware, it's the Gulf Stream that keeps Europe warm. But now with that Gulf Stream turned back, all of Europe became really cold. North America became cold. There was a global cooling event that lasted 1,200 years. And that global cooling event prevented the temperature from going up to its normal maximum. And so this explains why it didn't go up to 3 degrees centigrade above where it is now. But as it began to warm up from this younger Dryas event, it entered a very brief period of climate stability. And humans took advantage of this climate stability and began to upgrade their agriculture. Instead of planting just 1 acre, they would plant 300 acres. And instead of planting multiple grains, they would plant just one, because they knew that the climate was stable enough they could count on a bountiful harvest. And so this is the first time that humans began to specialize in their agriculture. This is when you see people saying, we're not going to plant anything at all. We're going to raise goats, but we're going to raise 10,000 goats, not just 4 or 5. Because again, they could count on the fact that the goats would be productive. And this is also the first time where you had people saying, we're not going to bother with food production at all. There's such a huge surplus of food. All of us here are going to form a village where all we're going to do is make pottery products. It's also the first time that you see people engage in large-scale art and music. It's when language starts to become written. Literature is when you get science and engineering being launched. To put this in context, before that period of climate stability, more than 99% of the human population was focused on coming up with enough food to keep them alive. Today, only 1% of the world's population is focused on producing food. What do the other 99% of us do? We go to university, we become engineers, scientists, computer coders, artists, musicians, we write novels, we write journal articles. So, we are free to turn our time into advancing technology. And that actually explains how we got this long period of climate stability. Because the beginning of that blue line you see there is when we have the tilt of the rotation axis going away from 24 degrees and towards 22. So we're in a long cooling cycle right now. And likewise, the shape of our orbit is becoming less elliptical. And when it becomes less elliptical, the climate cools. So all the natural cycles are cooling the Earth, but human activity is warming the Earth. Taking advantage of the brief period of climate stability, humans domesticated cows and sheep, and the domestication of cows and sheep and rice all poured more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So that began to warm the planet at exactly the same rate that the natural cycles were cooling the planet. And this has been going on now for 9,500 years. That little blue line you see there, those are very recent temperature measurements based on 74 different proxies for the past temperature. It's the first time we've got a reliable record of the temperature of the last 10,000 years, and actually reveals that the climate is 3 times more stable than what you see in the textbooks. The textbooks tell us it's stable to plus or minus 2 degrees. We now know it's stable to plus or minus 0.65 degrees. And it's that extreme stability that has enabled us to populate up into the billions and to have global high technology civilization. But as you also look at that blue curve, you can see it's very slightly declining. So over the past 9,500 years, the global mean temperature has very gradually dropped by 1 degree centigrade. And because it's so gradual, it's had no measurable impact on our civilization. And it hit a bottom in 1950. But since 1950, the global mean temperature has gone up by 1 degree centigrade. Right now, we're as warm as we were 8,750 years ago. And the concern is, if we keep on the trend that we've been on since 1950, we're going to warm the planet another 2 to 3 degrees centigrade. And if we do that, we'll melt the polar ice cap. And when you melt the polar ice cap, instead of having the Arctic Ocean area reflecting sunlight with 60% efficiency, it reflects it with only 6% efficiency. Open ocean liquid water now absorbs huge quantities of heat from the sun. And what happens to all that solar heat? It makes water vapor that drops as snow on Siberia and Canada. So yes, Canada's getting warmer, but it's still plenty cold enough to have lots of snow in the winter. I've got lots of relatives that live in Canada, and instead of it being 50 below in the middle of winter, it's 40 below. But you're still going to get snow at 40 below. You're not going to get rain. And this is actually what has happened in the previous ice ages. The planet warms up, melts the polar ice cap, and then you get huge amounts of snow falling on Siberia and Canada. It accumulates and forms ice sheets thousands of feet thick that cover virtually all of Siberia and over half of North America. And that cools down the whole of the planet and reforms the polar ice cap. So that's a concern. It's just the extraordinary fine tuning it takes to have this period of 9,500 years of extreme climate stability at an optimal temperature for human civilization. It's never happened before. This is literally the only time in the history of the earth where this has existed. It requires fine tuning the natural cycles and fine tuning the human activity. The fact that the two of them have perfectly balanced off one another is nothing short of a miracle. But I actually argue that this was biblically predicted. You see it in the book of Revelation, chapter 7, verse 9, where John has this vision and he says, "Before me was a great multitude that no one could count, every nation, tribe, people, and language." And at that time, the Greeks had a number system that went up to 1 billion. So I cite this text as a passage indicating that God's intent all along was that billions of human beings would be able to receive his redemptive offer of salvation through Jesus Christ. And for that to happen, you need high technology. You need the technology to be able to take the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ to all the people groups of the world in a relatively short period of time. Now, what you also see in the Bible is that God began his works of redemption before he created anything. So I actually argue in the book that it was God's goal all along that we would have this period of extreme climate stability where billions of us could live on planet Earth and hear and respond to the gospel message. Now, my theology happens to be premillennial. Not all the scholars at Reasons to Believe are premillennial, but I am, which means I believe that Jesus Christ will be reigning here on planet Earth for a 1,000-year period, once the full number of humans that God intends to redeem have been redeemed, as you see in Romans chapter 8, which would imply that God's intent is that we'd be able to sustain the climate stability for at least another 1,000 years. And I argue in the book that it's impossible to sustain it indefinitely because of the cycles that we're dealing with. But I do think it's possible that we can sustain extreme climate stability for another 1,400 years. But as many of you are aware, climate change is a political hot potato. I'm sure it's going to come up in the presidential debates. It's going to come up in all the Senate and congressional races. And what's driving the politics of climate change is you got one side saying, if we don't stabilize the climate, we're going to ruin the ecosystems for all their life. And we're going to especially make life difficult for the poor people of the earth. And therefore, we need to sacrifice our economy to stabilize the climate. If you actually read what they're writing, they're calling for a sacrifice of the economy by about a factor of 3, which means they really want all of us to live on 1/3 of the income we live on right now, and basically abandon a lot of our technological goodies. So basically they're saying, stop driving cars, only take public transportation, don't fly, stop burning coal and natural gas, no more fossil fuel burning. And I actually took my sons and a bunch of their friends aside and said, you know, this is what we're going to need to do. This is what politicians and scientists are saying we need to do to stabilize the climate. Do you guys want to see the, yeah, they said, we're all in favor of stabilizing the climate. Well, you need to get rid of all your high-tech toys, forget about driving a car, forget about the output from factories, that's all got to go. Forget about air conditioning. And they said, we'd rather see the end of human civilization than have to do without all that. And I think that's typical of people in the world. You know, a biblical principle is we human beings are fundamentally selfish. And so trying to get all the peoples of the world to live on a standard of living 1/3 or 1/4 of what they're living on right now, and make no mistake, it won't be good enough for the Europeans and the Americans to do this. This has to be a global sacrifice. You got to get everybody in India and China and Africa doing it as well. And I argue from a biblical perspective, that's an impossible sell. It's not going to happen. As long as we got sinners here on planet Earth, it's not going to work. But a bigger biblical principle is being overlooked. In the first chapter of Genesis and in the creation text in the book of Job, we have the explicit command that God has given us authority to manage the resources of planet Earth and the responsibility to manage them for the benefit of ourselves and the benefit of all their life, which implies we're not going to be caught between a rock and a hard place, like the politicians say we are. There will be solutions out there that will be maximally beneficial for human beings and maximally beneficial for the ecosystems of the world and for climate stability, and particularly beneficial for the poorest people of the world. And so as Ben pointed out, there's 2 chapters in the book that are loaded with about 40 win-win-win solutions. Things we can do to stabilize the climate that actually increase the world economy, put more money in everybody's pockets, actually advance technology, and at the same time, benefit the rest of the world's life, benefit the ecosystems, and stabilize the climate. I'm just going to end my talk here. You can read the book and get a bunch more with just a couple of examples. Number 1, we can replant the deserts. We humans made the Sahara Desert 10 times bigger than what it was 2,000 years ago. Today, it's bigger than Australia. Likewise, we made the Gobi Desert 4 times bigger than what it was 2,000 years ago. And this actually shows you the extent of the Sahara Desert, covers almost half of Africa. And actually during the 1960s and 70s, the Sahara Desert was advancing southward by 6 miles per year. And the reason for that very rapid advance, people living on the south edge of the Sahara Desert were scrounging vegetation and using it for cooking fuel. And so one proposal I make in the book, let's give the sub-Saharan peoples all the kerosene they want for free, and they can burn it to their heart's content on the condition they work with us to replant the Sahara Desert. And we already know how to do it. The Israelis have showed us how you can replant a desert and triple the rainfall over the desert. We could literally turn the Sahara Desert in one generation back to what it was like during the Roman Empire era. During the Roman Empire era, what is now the Sahara Desert fed Europe. That's where they grew all their grain. And so if we were to bring it back to that state, that means people in North Africa could make a healthy income from planting grain and selling it. There would now be another huge source of food for the world's population. So it's going to benefit more than just the Africans. It's going to create ecosystems for wildlife. And so wildlife will be able to return to what is now the Sahara Desert. And it's going to soak up huge quantities of greenhouse gases. Everybody wins. An example that's in the news today is what's happening to the Amazon jungle. The nations of the world are actually saying, we'll send in our armies to protect the Amazon jungle. Because what's happening is people living there are just cutting down the trees and just burning them, not even selling them. They're just burning the trees and then trying to convert the cleared land into pasture land and making money off of cattle. Completely unaware of the fact that Amazon soil is nutrient poor. Yes, you can raise beef cattle for about a decade, but after that, you'll have so stripped the land of its nutrients, you turn it into a desert. We're literally in danger of turning this huge Amazon jungle area into a desert like the Sahara Desert. And so what I propose in the book is that we go to the Amazon people and rather than send in an army, send in economists and basically explain to them, you'll make a whole lot more money if you manage the Amazon jungle. And what you need to recognize is the oldest trees in the jungle are those that are in danger of dying. And when they die, they decay. There's no money for lumbering when they decay. And then they affect other trees and get them decaying too. And that releases greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And these old trees grow 4 times more slowly than the younger trees. And so basically persuade them, go to the jungle and harvest the big old trees before they're in danger of dying. You make a lot of money on those big old trees. But when you harvest them, replant them with young trees. The young trees will grow 2 to 4 times faster. That's going to pull way more greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And if you take away all those decaying trees and you've got those fast growing trees, that creates more eco space for the wildlife that's there, for the different kind of plant species that there. So you actually get a much healthier jungle, able to sustain a much larger population of wildlife, and the people there will make a healthy income harvesting these old trees and selling them for lumber. And when you do that, carbon gets sequestered as furniture and as homes. And you got these fast growing trees soaking up huge quantities of greenhouse gases. Now, this is not only good advice for people living in the Amazon, it's very good advice for people living in Oregon and in Washington and in British Columbia, because this is where we got other rainforests. I'll just zip through these slides here. And here's a photo of a Northwest rainforest. And the problem we have in the US and Canada is we have these protected forests, national parks and national forests. and we basically forbid lumbering. And when we do that, these rainforests fill up with huge quantities of dead and dying trees. And this photo that I took in southern British Columbia shows you a place where there's so much dead trees that it actually stops the migration of wildlife. It basically creates an impenetrable pathway for wildlife. And so we'd be far better off with our national parks saying, let's let the lumbering companies come in the wintertime and selectively harvest the old trees that'll be in danger of dying if we leave them there any longer. Those are the most valuable trees in the forest anyway. And by clearing out these old trees, you create more eco space for the wildlife. You also thin the trees out enough that the bark beetles don't get an advantage. Like me, you've probably seen national forests where a third of the trees are dead. They're dead because we let the forest get overpopulated. And incidentally, when you let a forest get overpopulated, that's a prescription for forest fires. And we're experiencing that right now. Forest fires out of the ordinary because we simply let the forest get too dense. So by allowing lumbering companies to come in and selectively harvest the most valuable trees, the old trees, and replanting them with younger trees, it's an example where everybody wins. So let's not just look down our nose on the people in the Amazon, realize this is something we need to pay attention to in our own nation. Okay, I got a third example, but I'm going to stop here. This is an example of using thorium nuclear fusion to get up all of our electricity. I'll just simply give you the bottom line here. We have the potential for building thorium nuclear reactors all over the world, which would produce 100% of the energy needs of all the peoples of the world for about half the price of hydroelectric power. It would literally be the cheapest source of power that is conceivable. And the thing about thorium nuclear reactors, they're safe. You don't get the toxic waste that you do with uranium. The wastes are actually safe to handle after 50 or 60 years. It's impossible to have a meltdown, and it's impossible to use thorium nuclear reactors to make nuclear weapons. So I'll stop there. And let me see if I can exit here. Here we go. Okay. See if I can stop the share here.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ross. I'm going to demonstrate the feature on Zoom where you can go down to the reaction little button and hit the little hand clappy thing. So everybody hand clap, if not visibly, audibly, then visibly. So that was really excellent. We're going to open it up for questions now. And Belinda, maybe you can explain how we want to do that.
Yes. All right. For those of you who are on Zoom, if you go to your bottom panel, it says participants. And if you click on that, you'd be able to see the participants pop up on the right. And what you would do then is go to your name and kind of hover the arrow over to the right, and it'll say more. And then under more, you can see to raise your hand. And then I'll be watching for your hand raises, and I'll let Ben know that you are wanting to ask a question. Another way that you could do it is to type in your question if you wanted. Doug is going to be monitoring the YouTube live stream, and will forward the questions there from that you can put into the chat there. And yeah, so Ben, if you want to go ahead and take over.
Yeah, I will. So, and I'm going to take Zoom host privilege by asking the first question. And while I'm asking my question, you guys can tee up your questions. And honestly, this is the I think this is the part of the Zoom experience that is most profitable, that we actually get to ask our questions directly to the scholars. And so we're grateful for that. So Dr. Ross, I think of all there's two things that really stood out for me in your book. And the first one is the realization that we are in this unprecedented time of stability that has come from the interaction of the natural sequence being sort of uh, counterbalanced by human activity. And that's created this long-term stability that's now on the verge of going off kilter because our activity is increased so much. So that's one thing. But for me, the really intriguing thing is the proposal to really try to pursue these win-win scenarios where economically they're viable and profitable, but ecologically they're very helpful as well. So, and I love the examples that you've given and they're really innovative, and that's what makes them, so intriguing. My question is this: um, it's one thing to be able to propose these great solutions, but how do you see us actually moving from proposing them to implementing them? So I love the suggestion of replanting the Sahara. I love the suggestion of targeted harvesting of our national parks. I love particularly, converting from a beef-based meat economy to an ostrich-based. But what ideas do you have of actually putting these into practice? How can we come together and move forward on some of these great ideas?
Well, I think it's pointing out the economic benefits. When people realize just how much this is going to enhance our economy, everybody's going to vote for it. But the bottom line is people have to hear about it. The politicians need to hear about it. And the thing I've noticed in writing this book is that climatologists tend to be hyper specialized. They may be an expert on atmospheric physics, but really they don't look at anything else. And I've been amazed that really none of them are paying attention to what's happening on the sun. We got a solar climate as well. In fact, I propose in the book that we've had an exceptional period of a stable luminosity from the sun, but it is exceptional. And we would be wise, for example, to protect our electric power grids from a major solar flare. If we have a flare like we did in 1859, we're probably looking at tens of millions of people starving to death, because now, in order to feed the world's population, we need global power grids. And a really big solar flare would knock that out for at least a 2-year period. So there are things we can do to prepare, but the bottom line is people got to know about this stuff. If they don't know about it, they can't act upon it. And if they don't understand the economic benefits, and so, yeah, I run into people say, yeah, this is a good win-win solution, but exactly how much money is this going to put in everybody's pockets? And I did have to edit the book down. And so like the stuff on thorium didn't make it into the book, as did a number of other solutions that I had to cut out. Because after all, economics demands that you don't put out a 200,000 word book. But just getting the news out. And we were thinking, climate change is such a hot topic. It's going to be really easy to publicize this book. I mean, there is no other book like it. It's kind of the anti-Al Gore book. He's calling for draconian economic sacrifices. I'm calling for the exact opposite. Let's economically benefit everybody. But people need to see the bottom line and need to hear about it. And unfortunately, the book came out just when COVID-19 hit. And so that took center stage away from climate change. And so we're now gearing up to publicize the book again, because it looks like we're beginning, I just say maybe just beginning to come out of this pandemic. And as we begin to come out, I think people are going to once again be interested in climate change. And I am intrigued that it seems to be taking center stage in the November elections. So we're hoping there'll be opportunities to get this book publicized the way we believe, the way we planned it would be in the beginning. And incidentally, that's where all of you can help. People say, Hugh, why don't you get on these major podcasts and TV shows and the radio shows? How you get on those shows, it's people at the grassroots sending in emails saying, please have this guest on this subject. They get enough of those, it happens. If they don't, it doesn't happen.
Great. Well, thanks. Maria Teilhard from Bend, great to see you. You're up next. What's your question for Hugh?
Hey, how is everybody? I see a number of friends, old and new. Hi, Dr. Ross. So my question is this, Dr. Ross, you're so good at tying the gospel message to the science. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought or had any conversations internally in RTB about how we might approach what's happening around, especially the US with climate change and the effects, how you would approach conversations as to whether this is truly nature, a result of man's choices and consequences versus judgment. I mean, on my end, personally, I can't help at some level to overlay some of the historical, social injustice issues. I can't help but overlay them on top of some of the areas where we're seeing a lot of this turmoil. So yeah, I'm just wondering how would we begin to approach those conversations and think about what's going on in terms of the possibility of God's judgment, not necessarily as a result of consequences, but maybe, you know, nature, the rocks are crying out or the trees are crying out, that along those lines.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think simply undergirding the idea that the Bible tells us that we're sinners, because after all, we have a lot of powerful political people who have the worldview that human beings are fundamentally good. And that's not what the Bible teaches us. The Bible teaches us that that's God's goal to deliver us from being fundamentally evil to become fundamentally good. And so that's why I'm so committed to evangelism. The Bible tells us we change the world by changing people one person at a time. But, you know, this social justice thing is really getting front stage right now, even more than the COVID issue. And I think that's where we need to emphasize. We're talking about solutions for climate change that are going to maximally benefit the poor as opposed to the wealthy. And I think that's going to get the attention of people focused on social justice. Hey, we're coming up with solutions that are going to provide an easy upward mobility pathway, especially for the poor. I mean, I think they're going to jump all over it. And so it's one thing I've been trying to emphasize is this is going to benefit everybody, but the people who are going to benefit the most are the poor, and particularly in nations outside the US. Do you have a follow-up?
No, that was pretty much it. I mean, as I said, I have been, like I said, overlaying some of the historical and current challenges that we're facing just as a society, you know, from an economic standpoint, from, you know, social prioritization. And I can't help but think, oh my goodness, we're going to have to brace ourselves if, you know, this is any indicator of leaning towards judgment as opposed to just consequences of man's choices. So I appreciate that.
Well, where I think we are experiencing judgment, for the last few decades, we've been passing laws and developing social platforms, which are basically attacking the family. I mean, we're all aware that the divorce rates through the roof. Single parent homes are way up. The abortion rate is way up. And so we can get back to that biblical fundamental. And I think the way you do that is simply point out This erosion of the biblical standard of the family is hurting us economically. And when you look at where people are really hurting economically, it's those people groups where they don't have a traditional family of a father and a mother that love one another, stay committed to one another for decades, raise their children in the principles of virtue you see in the Bible, get them equipped for their careers so they can be independent. We're facing a dependency crisis here in the U.S. I mean, I've lived long enough just to see the rising percentage of our population that's dependent upon government assistance. And, the biblical principle is we help people in upward mobility. If we could change our welfare system in such a way that we provide a pathway, an easy pathway for upward mobility. So, in that sense, I do think we're being judged. And the judgment is hitting us economically. And it's not just hitting people who don't live, in a traditional family. It's hurting everybody.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for that question, Marie, and great to see you. And next up is Tyler Gaffney. Wow, good to see you, Tyler, all the way from somewhere in Southern California, I think.
That's
Go
right.
ahead.
Yeah, San Diego. Thanks, Ben. Appreciate that. Dr. Ross, great to be on here. And
Good
great to see you.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Great presentation as always. By the way, I mean, and just to espouse the benefits of, or what I appreciate about this is that your solutions have, not only just economic benefits, but scratch the itch of the social justice drive of our day and is environmentally responsible. And I love all that. But the one concern I had was related to substituting ostrich for beef, because I really like USDA prime ribeye. And I just want to know, how does ostrich taste in comparison to that?
Well, I tasted ostrich. Number one, it's actually a redder meat than beef. When you eat it, it has a very red color. Where it differs from beef, it's very low in saturated fat and cholesterol. It's really the healthiest meat you can eat, but it's also really tasty. If you like ribeye, you're going to really love
Okay.
burgers and ostrich steaks.
That's good to hear, because that's where you lost me. But I'm open. I'm going to be trying to be open to this thing, and I love that. But
there was a woman who was breeding ostriches, and she shipped a bunch of ostrich meats to her staff, and everybody loved it. So it's very lean, very healthy, very tasty. And it's tender. That's what I couldn't believe. I was expecting a super lean meat not to be tender. Not the case at all. It's a very tender meat. And where it has an economic advantage, if you raise ostriches the right way, you should be able to produce the meat for less than half the price of turkey meat, which now ranks as the cheapest meat that's on the market today. So you literally can drop the price of meat dramatically. The one downside with ostriches, you cannot raise them like beef cattle. With beef cattle, you throw them out into the pasture and you can ignore them and they're just fine. The problem with ostriches is they're highly social animals. They have to be close to one another, and they especially need human contact. The way you get really good productivity out of ostriches, make them your pets.
And then eat them.
And then eat them, exactly.
So I love this conversation. I'd love to keep the ostrich conversation going. But next up, we have Portland State NCM. But Portland State NCM, before you ask your question, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to advocate too in response to Tyler's question about ostrich meat. So I personally, I went to South Africa, which is really the home of where ostrich production has developed. And I went actually to the heart of it, which is a town called Oudtshoorn, near Cape Town. And I can tell you for a fact that the pan fillet of an ostrich is every bit as good as a filet mignon. It is superb. And the eggs are really good. You can use every part of the ostrich. So if you're interested in this, I'm going to make a little plug for one of the innovators in this in America. It's the American Ostrich Farms. So just go and Google, after this meeting, go and Google American Ostrich Farms and check out what Alex McCoy is doing there. And you can actually order ostrich meat and try it out for yourself. So I'd encourage you to do that. Okay, so that's my ostrich plug. So let's hear from Northwest NCM.
Hey, my name's Miriam, by the way. I just happen to be on our ministry account. But I am wondering, I appreciated your timeline of different climate changes that we've seen throughout history. And I was just wondering where you would place the flood in that timeline.
The flood of Noah?
Yes.
Yeah. I've written about that in my book, Navigating Genesis. And what you notice in Genesis chapter 2 is that Adam and Eve were created when 4 Noan rivers came together. And, 2 of those rivers flow today. 2 of them stopped flowing during the last ice age. But you can look at satellite imagery and see where those dry riverbeds are. Those 4 rivers come together in what is now more than 200 feet below sea level, the southeastern portion of the Persian Gulf. So that tells me that God created Adam and Eve during the last ice age. I also believe the flood of Noah took place during the last ice age. Why? Because Genesis 8 tells us it took 7.5 months for those flood waters to recede. It also tells us that one source of those flood waters were waters coming up from below. And the aquifer under Mesopotamia is not a very good aquifer, but there's an enormous aquifer underneath the Persian Gulf. And so I believe that the flood was taking place when the Persian Gulf was dry land. And I've got a map in Navigating Genesis where I show the probable extent of a Noah's flood. The traditional old Earth model limits it to Mesopotamia, but the model that I'm proposing has a flood that's about 4 times bigger than that, because I put it during the last ice age. And there's actually been a discovery of a berm at the mouth of the Gulf of Hormuz, the very southern entrance of the Persian Gulf. You can actually see evidence for a huge berm. And if that berm broke during the last ice age, that would provide a 3rd source of water. So you got the rain coming down, you got the aquifers being pushed up by tectonic plate movement, you got the rush of Indian Ocean water coming in, and then you got the melting of ice covering the mountains around that area. And in order to explain 7.5 months of receding waters, because those waters are going to be flowing under the influence of gravity out into the Indian Ocean. But it's like what happened in the Mississippi Valley about 30 years ago. There was a huge snowpack that year, and it melted rapidly with a heat wave, and it caused 50 feet of water to be standing over the Mississippi Valley for 4 months. The water was flowing out into the Gulf of Mexico, but as the water flowed out, it was being replaced by meltwater from that fast melting snow. Well, likewise, I believe what was happening with Noah's flood is the water that was flowing out was being replaced by the melting snow and ice on the mountains surrounding that region. And so that's why you got Noah on board the boat for over a year. He had to wait that long for the waters to recede. But if you put it during an interglacial, there's no way it would take that long for the waters to recede, no matter where you are in the world.
So you don't believe that it was global?
Yeah, 2 Peter 2:5, the world of ungodly people was flooded. 2 Peter 3:5 and 6, the world that existed at that time, cosmos tote. And what's interesting, this is Greek, and if you mean the whole world, you would have the Greek word cosmos without adjectives. But in both places where Peter addresses the flood, he attaches an adjective to the word cosmos. which means we're not talking the whole planet. We're talking the entire planet where human beings lived. And you actually see this in Genesis 7. It basically says that the flood wiped out all human beings and all of basar. Interesting Hebrew word basar. It means the soulish animals that are in relationship with human beings. Those are the animals that God wiped out. And for good reason. The book of Leviticus tells us that the only non-human life form that can be damaged by human sin are the nephesh animals that are in relationship with human beings. I refer to it as the mean dog syndrome. The reason why you have mean dogs, they're owned by mean owners. Dogs, like all nephesh animals, when they're in relationship with human beings, strongly express their desire to please their human owners. If their human owners are evil, they will be motivated to bring pleasure to those human owners by vicious behavior. And this explains why God said, not just the humans, but their animals as well, because their animals have been damaged by the reprobate behavior of those people. Whereas the animals in relationship with Noah were not. So God said, bring those on board the ark. They've not been damaged, but all the damaged nephesh animals must be wiped out. So on that basis, I would argue that there were no emperor penguins on board the ark because they live in Antarctica. And we've got good evidence that humans only got there a few hundred years ago. So there's no need for God to wipe out the emperor penguins or to flood Antarctica. There's no people there. There's no basar there. And so he could leave that alone. And if you go to the wisdom books, Job and Psalms and Proverbs, they explicitly rule out a global flood. How they do that is when they address creation, they will talk about creation day 3. Psalm 104 is probably the most explicit example of that. It's the longest of the creation psalms. And when it talks about creation day 3, it makes the point that God transformed our planet from a water world to where you now have continents and oceans. That's verses 6, 7, and 8 in Psalm 104. Verse 9 says, now that the continents are in place, never again will water cover the entire face of the earth. And that's repeated 4 more times in the wisdom books. It also explains that when I've debated people who adhere to a global flood, they always dismiss the wisdom books. They say, that's poetry, Hugh. You can't cite Hebrew poetry. And my response to that is, wait a minute, this is Hebrew poetry. It's not English poetry. Hebrew poetry is a very powerful tool for communicating didactic truths. And proof of that is where you get the most explicit and detailed teaching of the doctrine of the Trinity in the Old Testament is in the poetry of Isaiah. So it's simply, and when you talk to people who are fluent in Hebrew, they all recognize the difference between Hebrew poetry and English poetry. And therefore, I don't think you can dismiss what we see in Proverbs, Job, and Psalms.
So if there wasn't a global flood, like why did he not just have them hike and go live somewhere else?
Well, that's addressed in Hebrews chapter 11. Yeah. Hebrews makes the point that God had raised up Noah to be a prophet to his generation. And that's the principle you see throughout the entire Bible, that before God brings judgment on a reprobate people, he always sends a prophet first to warn them in an attempt to get them to repent. You know, another biblical example in the book of Genesis is Lot. God had Lot set up as a judge in the city of Sodom. And here was this righteous man warning the Sodomites that they needed to repent. But there came a time where God said, hey, they decayed into reprobate behavior to such a degree, they had to be wiped out, just like the people of Noah's generation. And you see this in both Genesis chapter 6 and Romans chapter 1. There reaches a point where humans become so reprobate in their behavior that they become, what you see in both the Greek and the Hebrew, a malignant tumor. And so what you see in Romans 1 verse 32, for example, is these people not only are intent on committing evil, they're intent on getting as many other people as possible to join them, to abandon their righteous lifestyle and become reprobate like they are. And so just recognizing that reprobation is like a malignant tumor. If you don't surgically remove it, the whole body dies. I argue in Navigating Genesis that the flood that God sent was an act of mercy. Humanity was in danger of self-extermination, but God stepped in and rescued humanity from exterminating themselves. Because if you got reprobates running around that are extremely evil, who are they going to commit their evil on? Not other evil people, but on the righteous. It explains what was happening during the days before the flood. I calculate in Navigating Genesis, just based on the population statements we see in the book of Genesis, that in the days before the flood, the murder rate was north of 95%. More than 95% of the human population was having their lives ended by being murdered by their fellow man. Matter of fact, I argue that today we have an average lifespan that's longer than the average lifespan in the days before the flood. Yes, people could live to be 900 years, but only a few got to die from natural causes. The vast majority were having their lives being terminated by being murdered when they're 15, 20, 30, and 40.
So that's great. And just to confirm, Hugh, you would recommend Navigating Genesis as the resource to go to for questions about specifically about the flood and
Yeah,
RTD
I mean, I
standard.
got a whole chapter there, and I'm basically laying out a principle. When you get into these controversial biblical issues, we need to recognize that the Bible is 66 separate books. And before you draw a conclusion, you need to integrate across all 66 books. You know, when I've debated Christian scholars on the flood, I notice how frequently they only look at 3 chapters, Genesis 6, 7, and 8, and basically saying, hey, there's a whole lot more content on the flood than just what's in the book of Genesis. It's not enough to take it literally. You have to take it literally and consistently. And that principle applies to things like divorce and marriage, how we should manage our income, what we think about the age of the earth, how we're to manage the planet, the climate change we've been talking about. You have to apply that same principle. Read all 66 books. And, you know, as a pastor, I'm not in favor of trying to encourage our people to read through the Bible in 1 year or 2 years. That's way too long. By the time you get to Revelation, you've forgotten what you read in Leviticus. And so I'm a firm believer in what I call rapid Bible reading. Read through the entire Bible in 6 weeks. You say, how can I learn everything in 6 weeks? You won't. Pick a topic. Pick some topic you want to get into and just say, okay, I'm going to spend 6 weeks. I'm going to read through the entire Bible word for word, but I'm only going to focus on what it's got to say about marriage and family. Everything else I'll let go because I'm going to read the Bible again. When I read it again, I'll pick a different topic that I'm going to focus on. And when you do that kind of rapid Bible reading, you get to see how it all hangs together. But if you take too long, you get to miss what the earlier authors of the Bible had to say.
Thank you.
Great. So we have a couple more questions and just a few more minutes. So Doug, you have a question, and then after Doug, we've got Norman Frater. So Doug, go ahead.
Thank you. I actually had 2 questions, if I could. The first one is probably the one that I'm most interested in, and that is you've been hearing a lot in the press about how there are people who will argue that if we don't solve climate change in the next 10 years, it's game over and the end of humanity, basically. In your book, I got the feeling that you don't see that urgency. I just want to know if that's in fact your view, and what you've got to say about that. So that's question one. Question two would be, so many people are claiming that climate change is driving a lot of these extreme weather events. And my humble understanding, which is I'm happily to be educated on, is that the science on that is a little bit unclear still yet, and we're not sure. So ascribing the forest fires in Oregon and California to climate change might be perhaps premature. That's the second question. I hope you can respond to those. Thank you.
Well, I'll respond to the second question first. These fires that we're experiencing are only very slightly out of the norm. I mean, one reason why we have such bad fires this season is we've been overprotecting our forests. I mean, I live in Southern California. Long before there were human beings in Southern California, the normal burn rate for the chaparral in our mountains was once every 8 years. And the chaparral there is well adapted to that frequency of fires. And in fact, if you don't have fires that frequent, you run into more problems. That's the reason why we got problems in California, because some of our forests and chaparral has gone unburnt for 20 and 25 years. That's way too long. And so when you do get a fire, you have this huge amount of fuel that just causes untold havoc. And of course, it's deadly for the wildlife that lives there. And so I think we'd be better off allowing nature to take its normal course. And I've written in my books that wildfires are critical to maintaining our ecosystem. That's thanks to wildfires that you get charcoal being deposited into the soil. And that charcoal provides nutrients. It's a conditioner which allows water to go deep into the soil. And so if we prevent wildfires from happening, we're actually doing harm to the environment. And I think the question is, we need to manage our forests and our grasslands and chaparral in such a way that they experience a natural burn rate, not an unnatural burn rate. And I'm all for putting up fire breaks, whereby if a fire does happen naturally, you can limit its extent. But overprotecting can be a problem, something we learned in Yellowstone about 20 years ago. Matter of fact, by allowing fires to burn in Yellowstone, you actually are creating habitat spaces for wildlife that never had them before. So in answer to that question, yes, we're slightly out of the norm, but not to a degree that we can say it's all the problem of global warming. Global warming is a factor, but it's not yet the most significant factor. And your first question, run that by me again.
Thank you. Yeah, the first question had to do with the urgency of global warming. There are politicians who have argued that if we don't solve global warming in the next 10 years, it'll be essentially game over for humanity. And in your book, I got the feeling that you probably wouldn't agree with that. I'd like to know if that's your view.
Well, I do believe that there is some sense of urgency here. However, an alarmist strategy basically causes people to do nothing. I mean, that's human nature. If you raise way too much alarm, they just kind of freeze and then nothing happens. And so we need to find a better way to get people moving in the right direction. And I argue the best and fastest way to do that is give them an economic incentive. If you give them an economic incentive, things will happen. So I tell my friend who are alarmist climatologists, if you really want things to happen fast, let's work on providing people with really strong economic incentives. And then we're not going to have to preach to them. We're not going to have to pass draconian laws. We're not going to have to tax them into submission. We give them a motivation, an economic motivation, and we could just stand back and let them do it. Now, I am against, however, what I see happening here in Southern California. We had politicians here saying we need to find ways to motivate people in California to put solar panels on their roofs. And so how they did it is they raised the electricity rates so high that it gave us all an economic motivation to put solar panels on our roof. So yeah, there are solar panels on my roof just because I realize I can be paying $0 a month for electricity instead of $300 a month. And, you know, the solar panels pay for themselves in just 4 or 5 years. So yeah, they're on my roof. But a much better way would have been to say, look, here's a way that we can lower the price of solar panel electrical generation by a factor of 3. If you do that, you don't have to tax people into submission. You basically give them a motivation to go ahead. And that's what concerns me. There's technologies that are in place now that could literally drive the price down. In fact, there's one company that's working on a roof. It's the same price. If they can scale it up, it'd be the same price as replacing your roof. But when you replace the roof, the entire roof generates electricity from solar power. Unlike the roof I got now, only a third of the roof space generates electricity. The other 2/3 do nothing. And I had to replace my roof. A much better motivation would be, okay, I got to replace the roof. I'm going to replace the roof for the same cost where 100% of my roofing area now generates electricity. And by the way, the electric company is going to pay me a bonus to generate more electricity than I need. Now I got an economic incentive.
All right, great. So Norman has had his hand up for a long time. So Hugh, if you're still okay, it's 8:30, but if we could go just a few more minutes, that'd be great. So
Okay.
Norman, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Ross. I like graphics, and I was puzzled on the graphic that we saw for quite a long time on the stability of the ice age cycles, and then this final segment that showed sort of a horizontal line. The axis on the left said temperature, air temperature, and it started at minus 30 degrees centigrade, and it went down to minus 60 degrees centigrade.
Right.
And I don't understand what that's the temperature of exactly, or where.
Okay. Well, my intent was to show you the raw data. So there's no interpretation involved there. And to do that and to take it back that far, I was basically using temperature measurements that were made in central Antarctica and north central Greenland. And so those are air temperatures. They're not ground temperatures, they're air temperatures. It's not the global mean average. On the other hand, it's directly proportional to the global mean average. So yeah, those numbers on the left, they're honest in the sense that they actually are directly related to the temperature measurements, but that's not the global mean temperature. Okay, you're muted.
I can read his lips. I know what he said. He said, aha, it all makes sense now. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, so it is a little bit after 8:30, and so I want to bring it to a close. I want to first and foremost thank you, Dr. Ross, for hanging out with us here. It's like I say, a privilege and an honor to have you, and very informative. Thank you all in the audience and everybody on YouTube for joining in. I highly recommend that we all get a copy of this book and read it, and then think about ways, as Hugh was saying, of getting the word out. I think the one thing that we can do is just spread the word about these both these amazing fine tuning things that Dr. Ross has so clearly articulated that point to a designer, but then the economically viable win-win solutions that will serve to break the logjam. And if we can take these ideas and run them up the flagpole and talk to the decision makers and just get the excitement going to start reforesting the deserts, to start having good forest management practices, and maybe even buy some ostrich meat and think about that transition. And yeah, dairy, it's really good, trust me. So that's, I think, one of the things that we can do to really make a difference. So with that, Dr. Ross, thank you very much. And for all of you out there on Zoom land and YouTube, thank you very much for joining us. And look forward to our next chapter meeting. You'll be getting the announcements for that. So with that, I'm going to close it out.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Blessings, everybody.
Yeah, blessings.